Welcome everyone to this Open Group webinar, which today has been brought to us by our partners at Avolution Software. Before I hand over to our speakers today, Peter Collins and Andrew Luthwaite, I'd just like to go over a few simple housekeeping issues to keep the event moving forward smoothly. Firstly, with the questions, and of course we would encourage you to ask questions today. If you'd like to ask a question of our panel today, the best way to do that is to write your question into the text QA facility. If you do write a question in there, can I ask you to address it to all participants? That way everyone gets to see all the questions that have been submitted. And our intention is to try and answer as many questions as we can at the end of today's presentation. If you'd like to simply share a comment or an opinion with a fellow attendee, then the best way to do that is in the text chat facility. So questions in the QA facility and comments and opinions in the chat facility, please. Now, today's event is being fully recorded, so if you have to leave early, or if you experience any local technical difficulties, and I know sometimes the audio can be a little problematical around the globe, then everyone who is registered for today's event will get an email with a link to the recording of today's webinar. So, Andrew and David, if you're ready, Peter, if you're ready, can I ask you to start today's presentation?
Okay. Simon, thank you very much for that, and thank you to your colleagues at the Open Group for inviting us to provide this presentation today. Well, as you said, I'm Peter Collins. I'm the region manager for Avolution for EMEA, and I'm joined by Andrew Luthwaite, one of our consultants. And indeed, Andrew's actually going to be doing the majority of the work. I'm just going to be giving him a brief, or giving the presentation a brief introduction, and then passing over to Andrew. As I say, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for attending. Just to kick things off, I'm just going to spend a very brief moment just to talk a little bit about Avolution. I'm kind of figuring that most of you will certainly hopefully know who we are. You can see from the slide that we've been doing what we do for some 19 years now. Indeed, a lot of that time we've been very actively involved with the Open Group as well. So you can see we are a company with a global presence. We've got 7 offices worldwide now, clients obviously globally in 100 countries and over 3,000 clients now around the world. And then just finally, this point in the middle, our position as far as the analysts are concerned, we're now positioned very much as a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant and the Forrester Wave, and come out very well in a lot of independent EA tool reviews. I mean, hopefully amongst you there'll be a good number of customers, which is great. As I say, hopefully there'll be others that have just simply seen and heard the various other presentations that we've done in the past. Avolution is a member of the Open Group. As I say, we've been active with the association for a good number of years. Our tool is fully certified against both TOGAF and Archimate. So in that respect, as I say, we're well positioned to provide you what I think is going to be an interesting presentation today. And I think of all of the ones that we've done, this one certainly seems to be standing out in terms of the number of attendees that we've actually got, which is great. So we've obviously picked a popular topic. And certainly one in which we know, just from our own experience of working with our clients, helping them in the work of migrating their organizations to cloud, it's certainly one of the most popular use cases in which we're involved these days. So, as I say, I'm just going to really help set the scene before we get into the detail, if you like, of the presentation. And you can see from my very first slide, perhaps highlighting some of the facts which I guess through experience some of us have learned. It may not have been originally intended to be this way. As the quotation says, cloud was supposed to make things easier. And indeed, certainly on the face of it, and I guess most organizations have had some very positive experiences as well of using products or services in the cloud. Obviously, the provisioning, the ease of provisioning that they provide, the scalability, virtualized resources, and certainly the subscription model that can underpin them can certainly make their use very beneficial. It all seems very straightforward. But of course, that's not necessarily the whole picture. And I've got a couple of quotations here from a recently published article which sort of helped to bring together, I guess, some of the issues and concerns that organizations soon face as they get into deploying more and more systems to the cloud. And indeed, what has on the face of it the potential to be offer a simplification to the way organizations work can in many cases lead to greater levels of complexity just through the adoption of multiple discrete approaches to using cloud, to perhaps using different providers, different hosting services. And the result being that sometimes the management of the estate in this manner can actually be even more complex than it might have been in the past. So as I say, a quotation or two from InfoWorld, and we'll come back to them in a moment. But we have actually got on our next slide just a couple of other points that again help to set the scene, if you like, in terms of the challenges with using cloud. These being some stats from a fairly recently undertaken survey by Computer Weekly, drawing out some of the challenges that respondents have faced. You can see some 90% having found that migrating to the cloud has been problematic and certainly leading to delays. Of course, concerns around security. I say, of course, not necessarily needs to be the case, but it is, of course, one of those things that is often raised. But this last point, some 39% of respondents saying that the benefits that they'd hoped to see through cost savings haven't necessarily been realized. And really, this last point that we've also brought here, this quotation from Gartner, just reinforces that point further, that many organizations could be overspending by some 70% in their current cloud strategy. So these are important issues, major issues, and certainly challenges. And Andrew, if you just go to that last slide, I said I would return to yet another quotation from InfoWorld, there is perhaps an answer to this, and obviously that's the focus of our presentation today. Whilst there are benefits that everyone wants to aim towards obtaining in going to the cloud, it's important that the approach that's taking, the planning that's put into this, is appropriate to achieve those benefits and not to get bogged down in complexity, not to be incurring these extra costs. And we think at the heart of that appropriate planning is an architecture-based approach. And that's what we'll be getting into some detail of now. And so with that, let me pass over to Andrew.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Peter. So as Peter mentioned, the bulk of the presentation today, if you like, will of course be focused on cloud migration or cloud transformation, if you like, and we'll talk briefly about the discrepancies, I guess, or the differences between those. There are kind of 5 stages that we're going to be going through throughout the presentation to try and give you an idea of, if you like, the essential elements for cloud migration strategies. Some of these, of course, relate to the initial setup phases in the preparation, so how you're putting a business case together. That tend to then fold around calculating and at least discovering the different types of data that you have. We'll then take a look at the factors or the KPIs that are going to be of interest, the different strategies that you might undertake, and then we'll start looking at how we can start visualizing and start managing some of the outputs that we get from these use cases. Some of these phases, if you like, as much as they're on here as numbered, they do happen in line with each other. So 3 and 4, for example, tend to happen iteratively. You can kind of group some of these together and kind of treat them as their own mini migration projects. So that's certainly something we'll highlight as we go through. So the first thing to discuss really is the initial stages of putting together a business case, or at least preparing for a cloud migration. And before even getting to that stage, I guess, the first question you might be asking, or people tend to ask, is why cloud? So you've seen from some of the initial stats at the beginning, some of the biggest issues, I guess, is that maybe people aren't aware of the benefits. In some cases, people jump in, both feet first into a migration effort without actually planning anything. As much as those stats at the beginning might have seemed relatively daunting, there is a good side, of course. The flip side is that 86%, so it's a huge majority of IT decision makers do ultimately agree that the benefits of cloud are compelling enough that outweigh its downsides. And that's evident from some of the highlighted aspects we've raised here. Increased flexibility is one of the key ones, not just for kind of scaling products, but it also provides some kind of strategic value as well. This is something that you probably need to start convincing stakeholders of. And often is the case that it's good practice to start with the end point you want to achieve, really. So you really do need to start asking yourself, what kind of KPIs are we interested in? What's going to be the most powerful in informing and influencing these decisions? So this is really what you should be aiming to pull together and try and outline some of the key benefits of cloud transformation projects. Now, some of the key elements that you might want to consider, of course, both range around business and IT aspects. So it is both a business and IT journey. And this starts at the beginning. Linking the objectives both from a business case or an IT case usually then leads to some of the beneficial or some of the successful business outcomes. The key aspect of all of this is a common understanding. Everyone needs to be involved and everyone needs to understand what the end goal is. It's quite easy for people to turn around and just say, can you migrate this to the cloud? Really, that's such a vague comment that you really need to start analyzing the benefits and the downsides of migrating, the technical details, the users that would be affected, and ultimately the impact of change. So, of course, lay out a plan, link that to specific goals or objectives. You might be looking at reducing costs. You might be looking at reducing kind of employee engagement levels in terms of how much they have to maintain these systems. You're also looking at maybe more of a competitiveness in the marketplace. All of these tend to lead to business outcomes together for a good, successful business case. Now, the other key aspect, and that you'll see, as I mentioned, through most of this presentation, is don't jump in straight away, of course. You need to put together some kind of pilot, some kind of proof of concept so that you're understanding those benefits early on. Failing quickly, of course, is a good quote in this instance. You do need to almost immediately understand what's going to happen if we do migrate things, both technically and, of course, from a business aspect in terms of your users, both internal, external, so employees and customers. So don't go for a wholesale migration. Speak to each line of business, speak to different groups of users, and then just evaluate these different cloud technologies before jumping in. Hopefully that's what will give you some ideas of through this presentation as well on how you can put these key benefits together. One of the other things, of course, is road mapping. And this comes down to some of the other presentations we've done in the past. But as much as you are thinking at the beginning of the benefits and the outcomes, you do, of course, need to start thinking of how you're going to be displaying this to different stakeholders. This does come down from an enterprise architecture perspective to the types of elements that you're capturing. So, for example, you want to be introducing things like the services that are involved, the infrastructure, what standards are involved, different application portfolios, risk mitigation. There's a whole host of challenges that are involved. But of course, as one of the first quotes said, as we get better at architecting this stuff, we get better at planning these cloud migration efforts, then the outcomes are going to be much more beneficial. So road mapping, as I mentioned, we've done extensive WebExes on before, and I won't bore you too much with all of those details right now, but it's going to be one of the key areas that take us through each of these 5 phases. The second part, I guess, for any cloud migration is to essentially understand different portfolios. So I mentioned things like services, infrastructure, and applications. This is usually the first challenge. So it's really important to get over this first hurdle. You do need a good data set to begin with. You can't really be flying blind too much in this instance, and because that certainly will come back to bite you towards the end. And that's typically why most cloud migration projects tend to fail, or at least that's where some of the myths or the stigma come from in terms of the negatives. So building a good data set, building a good portfolio is key. So you're looking at things like the dependencies, any regulatory requirements, integrations, and even things like shadow IT. This comes down to being one of the key things that you'll find during this discovery phase, is that a lot of costs these days do tend to center around shadow IT. things that are installed that you weren't aware of. So this is going to be probably something you discover, and early is better than late in this instance. You don't want to migrate something just to find out that someone has a database installed on their machine that's critical for a certain service and you had no idea it existed in the beginning. So a lot of this work does come down to, of course, data discovery. In a couple of ways, this helps with having good relationships with different lines of business, different application owners, although you can, of course, as architects, leverage some other techniques as well. So there's a whole bunch of integrations for things like Technopedia. You can leverage the content from your SharePoint sites, from Confluence, from Jira. These are all the things that are going to complement some of the portfolios you've put together. There's also going to be some kind of co-ownership of this data. And you'll actually see later on how we can start using some more modern techniques, using stuff like machine learning and algorithms to help you predict some values and give you a starter as a portfolio. Before getting into some of that, I did mention some of the key areas to consider. And I do quickly just want to show or highlight some of the questions that you might want to ask around these different areas. Because there are a lot of factors, I guess, from different domains that do need to be taken into consideration. So some questions around the business area might be, what is the risk tolerance for certain business migration efforts? What's the criticality of some of these applications? And how are these solutions going to be accepted by the business owner? So business considerations, of course, is going to be one of the key things at the beginning. A couple of others in here, so around technology and applications. You want to find out if some of these applications are still in the planning phase. Are they actually in production yet? Is there a requirement here for high availability and disaster recovery? Do things need network isolations or virtual private networks? These are some of the questions, again, you're going to want to ask some of these application owners, at least some of the IT team as well. Surrounding security and data, of course, there are compliance metrics that we can talk about, and we will quickly outline later on the difference, I guess, between security and compliance, and they do tend to differ. However, from a security perspective, you're going to want to be able to monitor these things as well. What controls are in place? Are there exit strategies? Is there certain considerations around cloud vendors? Is SSO a requirement? These are the things that are going to help govern and help shape how you build your cloud portfolios. From a data perspective, of course, similar concerns again, confidentiality and privacy around data. Also, of course, security goes hand in hand with maintaining that data. Integrations, one of the last consideration points here, of course, is key as well. A lot of the applications that you might use these days or services, typically they are interacting with each other. They're sharing data sets. There are dependencies here as well. So you need to make sure that if you lift one application, which other applications are going to come along with it. So understanding how these integrations are set up, what API calls are being made between different services, this is how you can start shaping your integration case around cloud migration. Now, there are many other questions, of course. We can certainly give you some best practices on what you should be asking different stakeholders, but really getting back to building that initial portfolio, I guess at the beginning that kind of seems daunting. You have all of these things to consider, all of these different lines of businesses and portfolios to build. Starting from scratch can seem quite difficult. Now, there are, of course, as I mentioned, a few techniques that you can leverage. When you are building data sets, and one of the first things I guess that people tend to do is send out surveys. So trying to build some kind of inventory, sending out surveys means that people can provide their opinion on different applications or services that you have internally. Now, of course, that's relatively manual. So you might also want to start, as I mentioned, integrating with other tools. And one of the key things here from an enterprise architecture perspective is trying to assign an EAID to each object. So having a central repository, making sure all of this content is tagged and logged, and also making sure that you can promote things into production. This is going to give you a much better understanding of your current state. Additionally in here, we've got machine learning. Now, machine learning, I guess, is a relatively new topic around EA. It's obviously existed for quite some time. And the easiest way, I guess, of defining it, it's almost explaining the unexplainable. It's one of those concepts I'm sure we've all heard of outside of EA. So even companies these days that use machine learning for Amazon using it for reviews, or PayPal use it for things like transaction fraud detections. There's a whole bunch of companies out there that use machine learning. That doesn't mean that enterprise architects can't leverage that same functionality. One of the key benefits is to take the guesswork out of some of the decisions that you're making. Some of the insights that machine learning can assist with is around making predictions. And the fact that this machine learning algorithm is constantly running, it's constantly learning, it's using real-time data, means that you're going to instantly get these notifications for when something does change or when something needs to change as well. So in an architect profession, what that's going to allow you to do is quickly identify things like system hotspots, where is a system used the most by different processes and different services. Maybe there are certain applications that are providing the same functionality or capabilities, and machine learning can maybe suggest that they become one system, perhaps. You might also have some cloud scoring mechanisms. So machine learning, I guess, is something that's almost non-deterministic. You can have the same input, but always have different outputs. Algorithms in general, of course, is something that you might want to also generate to help build up a better use case. The other key thing around machine learning in general is it's learning constantly. So the more data that you're going to be contributing to this list, the more machine learning becomes accurate. And you'll have some kind of confidence level in predicting these values. And again, this isn't kind of rising machines, machine learning isn't taking the job away from architects. It's purely there to suggest what could be done. We at Avolution, of course, have developed many algorithms as well. So we've done things for application rationalization, cybersecurity, cloud migration, of course. So feel free to reach out to us if you want some specific algorithms as well. Now, collecting all that information, building up portfolios, as I mentioned, one of the key areas to understand. The next, of course, is moving into something like a design phase. Now, the design phase itself goes hand in hand, if you like, with some of the portfolio discovery activities. Really, you're trying to take into consideration, what strategies you want to deploy. So modern cloud migration, essentially trying to focus on certain KPIs. This is to make sure that there's some kind of consistent story being told. So having these portfolios available, having the design working as well, means that it's quite transparent so that everyone in the organization understands each phase and understands what that end outcome is. Now, core metrics, of course, that you capture does tend to influence some of these KPIs as well. So really what you want to do is focus on some key metrics. You want to really provide clear direction quickly. Also providing some kind of compelling case for change. So of course, from an IT perspective, you might have all of these metrics. From a business perspective, that needs to translate, usually at maybe a capability level, but usually, of course, for a cost-saving benefit as well. And of course, finally, you do want this to remain current and relevant. And we'll come on to maintaining some of that information later on as well. Now, when we talk about metrics, of course, it's complex. So you could calculate any metric you like, of course. You could have any of these manually inputted into the lists that you're building. But really, the word of warning here is focus. As much of all of these do become quite important, you do want to try and focus on some of the highly critical ones. There are some, I guess, general rules of thumb to take into consideration. You would have perhaps seen some previous WebExes we've done as well for various customers, and they've provided some good insights that they've gone through cloud migration strategies. And one of the first things, I guess, is try not to collect every field imaginable. You will literally be there for years if you're trying to calculate and manage every single field. So try and understand what's important. Is it cost? Is it complexity? Is it security? Is it the rate of change? Is it the customer experience? You might say all of the above, but really focusing on a key metric or a handful of key metrics is critical. Secondly, I guess, don't collect data that you don't have a use for. Typically as a consultant at Avolution, it's something that you'll find most customers tend to do with us. And it's what we tend to do is we ask why. Why do you need to calculate that metric? Why do you need to model that specific scenario? That's going to be key to understand what you're trying to do. If you don't have a use case for it, then excess data really does complicate the entire model. So really just slow down, try and understand, and try and focus what you're trying to achieve. Finally, I guess on collecting data, it's always quite difficult to understand where to look. So don't really try to attempt to collect data that you don't really have a source for. And we've talked about sources earlier on in terms of things like Excel sheets, Visio documents, ServiceNow, Confluence. All of these are usually great sources for information. So don't try to collect things you don't have a source for. It's quite difficult to go through those surveys every single time, and quite likely it will trip up what you're actually trying to achieve. So after considering all the metrics, narrow down your assessment to only a select few. Now coming back, I guess, to this storytelling approach, you do need to start convincing, or of course during the design phase, telling a story through the models that you're building. A big part of enterprise architecture is there to inform and influence, and also, of course, to motivate some change. So we can provide some recommendations through some of the visuals that you produce. You might hold regular workshops that effectively have different lines of businesses all engaged. So, of course, speaking to each line of business individually is going to be beneficial, but usually you lack sight of how that affects other areas. So it's going to be key to work with different people, but in the same workshop as well. And that's just to make sure that everyone is, of course, informed about any changes that happen. There are, of course, cultural changes as well, things to take into consideration, but usually we come down to some key principles for storytelling. Change is normal, iterate quickly, test early and often, automate all the repetitive tasks. These are some of the things that will come out during the design phase. And also during that design phase, be sure that you're aligning each visual that you present to each stakeholder. At the end of the presentation or towards the end, I'll show you some examples of successful dashboards. But really the key is, of course, who am I speaking to? What am I trying to convince them of? And what best approach can I take? That, of course, takes into consideration all the data that you've collected. From a cloud migration perspective, that can be a little difficult, but the idea is to start showing slow progress and trying to understand where the benefits become early on. Most people, of course, don't want to look at these architectural diagrams either. So again, from the dashboards I show at the end, that's something that's maybe a bit more business friendly. And again, trying to focus them on key metrics like cost. I always come back to cost. It's probably one of the biggest influences. That's going to be key to getting people's attention. Coming back to the myths again, that people think some cloud migrations are costly. We can try and alleviate that by giving people a clear roadmap of where we're headed in different design phases through different architectures and models. So the next stage is choosing some kind of strategy. So migration strategies, I think we can probably group these into almost 6 different categories. I wouldn't necessarily say it's either or. And what you will find is that you'll probably be reusing, or at least using multiple of these strategies. Most organizations, so the majority from the statistics and the customers that I've worked with, do tend to opt for this first one, which is rehosting. It's the majority one. It's almost like a lift and shift approach. You lift one kind of on-premise application or database and then rehost that in some kind of cloud migration project. Other strategies tend to get adopted further down the line. Typically, of course, things like retire and retain. Self-explanatory, is probably not much to say around those right now. Visually, you can actually see the stages that each strategy goes through as well. So there are, of course, differences for each strategy. The key thing here is that there's a constant and consistent end approach, which is to validate your target models, the transition phase, and then pushing those into production. And of course, at the beginning, you're always going to go through this discovery phase as well. Again, a quick thing to highlight and reiterate is the idea of a proof of concept. It's going to be crucial for determining the feasibility of some of these strategies and then quickly understand how effective they're going to be. I do want to quickly highlight, I guess, 3 of those key strategies. So the reason we're going to focus on 3 is typically things like retain and retire, probably self-explanatory, and repurchasing, of course, just means migrating to a new vendor, let's say. However, the 3 we're going to be looking at right now is rehosting, replatforming, and refactoring. Each of these strategies, of course, have their pros and cons, but I just want to give a quick overview of each strategy and I guess how some of the benefits can be realized early on. Now, back in probably 2015, I would say, there was a GE Oil and Gas as a company, and quite a few other customers, of course, have found this since. And this is, I guess, why rehosting tends to be the majority of customers. It's probably around 85% of customers that deploy this as their first strategy. They quickly found that up to probably about 30% of its costs could be saved by simply rehosting databases and applications. Mainly databases. Applications tend to be a bit more difficult, but certainly databases. And it's a huge saving from immediately rehosting content. One of the reasons, I guess, is if you are moving things on-premise to cloud, what you're really doing is you're saving from things like office space. There's no excessive amount of training required to maintain these servers, from overheating. There's some clear benefits initially from simply rehosting content. One of the issues with rehosting typically is you really are just dipping your feet into the water here of cloud migration, or at least cloud transformation projects. There are, of course, some other key benefits that you'll see from the other 2 strategies. But rehosting is really there for speed of migration. You're probably going to see reduced risk as well. It's a relatively simple method of rehosting content. And you do have a broad ecosystem of tools to choose from. So rehosting, probably going to be one of the majority of the initial strategies. Over time, you then might move on to things like replatforming. Now, the way we can probably describe replatforming is you're trying to make use of some of the cloud optimization features. So you probably have maybe migrated a couple of applications or databases. Now you're really trying to shape this application, let's say, to being a bit more cloud native. So there are various aspects of this, quite a few technical details that you might consider. But cloud, of course, does then give you the opportunity and advantages of using things like load balancers. You can instantly replace VM machines. There are configuration and operational processes that can be migrated without really affecting the application too much. The way of thinking about replatforming, it is just a step or a phase of evolving an application to being more cloud native. And I'll get on to some of the cloud native concepts towards the end of these as well. Benefits, I guess, for replatforming, of course, differ. It's not too difficult, especially if you have engineers that have already gone through that rehosting process. They probably do understand more around the application. Of course, more data is needed, but it does give you some of the key benefits. You'll also immediately see decreased management costs. You'll have higher availability in here as well, and you might have models where you have costs that match consumption. So replatforming, trying to take advantage of all those cloud native features that you might have after rehosting. The third one, refactoring, is probably one of the biggest changes. This is important because you do need to, of course, know a lot of detail around the applications, and it's key at this stage to understand which applications would benefit the most. So refactoring, you can almost think of it as almost recoding applications from the ground up. So then you can start leveraging the true features and the true advantages of a typical cloud native application. So one of the huge advantages of refactoring legacy applications, for example, is while that process is occurring, that application itself can obviously still run locally. So it doesn't really affect productivity at all. There's nothing too major to consider around refactoring and having the application running. So it's going to be one of those key areas to consider. One of the key differences, I guess, between this and it is moving much more toward a cloud native approach is that it's not just pulling data from cloud storage, but you are also running that type of analytics, running computations at cloud level as well. So really, the benefits here you need to start thinking about is how this is a long-term investment, a long-term cost reduction. You're going to get, of course, increased resilience here. You are building these applications from the ground up again. And it means you can fully exploit some of the cloud innovation that's out there. Now, I've mentioned cloud native a few times. We don't have too much time to go into all of the details here. But really what I mean by this is running applications that really do take advantage of this kind of cloud delivery model. So it's not really about where things are deployed, it's usually how. Now, some of the key benefits or the advantages, and I'm sure you've heard of some of these before, they're going to be, like I say, limitless computing power or near limitless computing power, depending what people promise you. Of course, you're going to get things much more on demand, and you're going to have much more of a modern data and application service environment. Some of the other key benefits of here, of course, is then utilizing containerization for some of these applications or microservices. And it's going to give you a much more of a continuous delivery model, much more of an agile model to work with. This particular maturity model does range as well. Certainly, I would recommend taking a look at some of these aspects. API first design is one of the key areas to consider, but also this 12-factor app methodology. I'd suggest researching that a little. It really does break down some of the features that are going to be required for building applications to be cloud native. And really, of course, this is just building on the principles of cloud first. Now, some of these, of course, you're already doing. Some of this hopefully is going to mean you can start building these applications, building services that are going to be much more robust and, of course, on demand much more as well. As much as all those strategies are great, there are, of course, things that we've come across that don't work so well, and things just to consider, or I guess say red flags that you might want to be aware of. Some of the pitfalls, typically, especially for things like lift and shift migrations, is not to take that wholesale approach. You do need to start having some regard for the refactoring or re-architecting process, especially if you want to utilize all of the advantages that cloud does bring. Other things that you might want to, of course, consider is that not every service, infrastructure, database, or application is suitable for cloud migration. Some things aren't just architected to scale. Of course, re-architecting those will work, but this is where you can start understanding which applications via those portfolios are going to be the initial ones that you focus on. Some, of course, are maybe too expensive to migrate. On-premise solutions do still have their place. And we haven't talked too much right now around things like public, private, and hybrid approaches to cloud, but that's another area to consider. Not everything should be cloud-based. Of course, there are going to be situations where things can't be moved. That today does tend to lead into some of the topics around technical debt. So we'll certainly highlight some of those issues or concerns as well. Now, one of the final stages in that 5-stage process is operation and optimize. Depending on what strategy you've chosen, of course, each strategy will end up leading to this particular case. If you are taking full advantage of everything that cloud has to offer, at this point you have things like auto-scaling, multiple availability zones, cheaper data storage options. This is where the optimization comes into play. So at times you're going to be refactoring, re-optimizing these components and applications over time. These aren't things that you'll be doing, of course, initially. What that does rely on, of course, is a clear, consistent current date. So if you do have a current state, you want to make sure it's maintained. So we all know, of course, application data or any type of data that you collect, it's always a moving target. So when you're building cloud migration roadmaps on top of existing data, you always want to make sure that that data is up to date. This does, of course, relate back to the initial solution at the beginning, which was to get better at architecture and planning. The data itself, of course, is what's driving these recommendations and decisions. So the way to keep this up to date, of course, is to have this embedded, maybe in existing tools that you're already using, and just making it easy for these data owners. If you try and reduce this barrier to entry for some people, as much as we talk around things like enterprise architecture and enterprise architecture tools, most users probably don't need to know that that's what they're doing. You might just simply give them a Excel style list and then they can actually integrate and update this data. The key thing here is, again, trying to remove this swivel chair approach. You can, of course, have this embedded anywhere you like. Making it embedded in Teams, of course, is key, because then you're starting conversations with people and you're making sure that things like application managers and process owners are always going to be updated on this data. Those managers, of course, are going to be key as well. They want to make sure that this data is maintained and it isn't going stale. So it's a key thing to consider. The good news, and there is good news, don't worry, is that once you do have all of this set up, it becomes much easier to maintain. So we've talked before about machine learning, around the algorithms. This is going to make it easier to keep this data current and relevant. The other idea is that once you do collect this data, you start small. And over time, of course, then you'll build up some other metrics. Dependencies, cybersecurity metrics, technical debt, exploring how the infrastructure depends on each other. And that's going to be key for maintaining this data. Beyond the actual migration, of course, we talk about operation and optimize. And once these strategies are in production, you will, of course, want to monitor that as well. So having some kind of continuous monitoring of these services is going to be key. If you want to start making small or even large adjustments to this, what you will want to start doing is, of course, is prioritizing those changes, but also trying to understand what this future state looks like. So you've built your current state. However, now you want to go through those phases of building those future states. And this, of course, could be after your cloud migration projects. It's an iterative process. As soon as one thing moves to cloud, that isn't really the end of that transformation project. You might call something cloud migration, but the transformation itself is, of course, getting everyone else involved. Exploring some of the more features that cloud enables you to, getting more people involved, working on customer experience, and making sure that there's a continuous cycle to this process. Probably one thing to consider is, well, what role do I play? We've talked about application managers and business owners and process managers. As architects, your key role, of course, is to make the invisible visible. So when we start talking about designing systems, putting together business cases, recommending different decisions, this is where you're going to be utilizing some of the key benefits. So if you do want to start convincing stakeholders, try to give them something that's much more dynamic and visual. So dashboards that you put together are going to be key for influencing those stakeholders. Making all of that available in one location will also mean that they can explore those changes. You don't have to put PowerPoint slides together anymore. Dashboards are going to be one of the dynamic ways of making all of this content visible. Also, making it editable is going to be key, because if people see that this data is incorrect, it gives them the opportunity to go in and correct that. This does, of course, mean a strong cloud computing strategy. You have visibility of the current state. You have visibility of the technical infrastructure and business requirements. You've built these current state and future state models, and now you have continuous monitoring for each of these services that you've developed. Maintaining that information, of course, is key. One of the next stages you probably want to start considering is how these metrics come into play. So you'll want to start understanding how you start building algorithms. Do we want to understand about the complexities of these new systems we've deployed? What is the risk associated to these? What kind of security metrics do we want to consider? This is where you can start building algorithms to determine the next stage. Again, coming back to cost, building a cost strategy for cloud migration is always going to be difficult. Vendors have different costs, technologies have different costs. There's going to be different costs over public and private cloud migrations, hybrid deployments. Building all those cost portfolios into one view is going to be key. You don't also have to know the costs of individual systems. Of course, you might want to aggregate these across your model. So you don't always have to know the specific details. Start leveraging areas you do know a lot about and use that to influence other areas. So again, it doesn't have to be all manual. And once you start scoring key areas of the business, then you can automate these calculations. And these are the metrics, of course, that are going to be defining some of the cloud migration strategies that you have. I appreciate we do have time for questions at the end. So a couple of things I do want to quickly clarify with you is what's next. Because once you've gone through those 5 stages, I do want to quickly highlight some of the other webinars we've done and how that, of course, integrates to cloud. Because some of these areas are obviously crossing each other. Some of the migration efforts that you put out there, of course, will have things like security considerations. Things like cybersecurity is a fast-paced environment. Security and risk technically, is separate. You don't really want to confuse those two. Also, you don't really want to confuse security and compliance. It's something that I see common these days. Just because you're compliant with the standard, that doesn't mean that you're secure as a system. So security and risk is usually under the organization's control. Being forced to accept a regulatory compliance is not. So just make that differentiation. One of the things here, of course, is to create things like risk assessments. So don't always let IT be in charge of this. Don't let only the IT team be part of the security team. They also need to show how operationally these risks are going to be in there if you don't start innovating and don't start adopting new technologies. That can be, again, done in various ways. The first thing, of course, is get a tool, have a centralized repository, get all those properties and attributes that you want to score, run those through an algorithm, and then iterate that and refine and improve that data as you go on. Cybersecurity, again, a key one that we've worked with various companies on. Sophos, one of our customers, have actually developed their own model, and we have a great case study on this as well, which we can forward on to anyone who's interested. A couple of other key areas, very quickly to highlight, is technical debt. Again, we've done WebExes on this, but really the focus is what are the changes we're going to be making, and what are the impacts of not making changes. Technically, when we start thinking about technical debt or maybe enterprise debt or architecture debt, it's a key part of that portfolio analysis. You want to understand the impact that debt has on infrastructure, technology landscape, how you hold that data and how it's used and how you deliver services to customers. Technical debt goes hand in hand with cloud migration. And it's going to be part of that design phase, discovery phase, and of course, leading into things like shadow IT. Technical debt can be something that you build up over time. One of the final points, just before getting into some of the examples and some closing slides, is how you start motivating action and ownership. Really, this comes down to a people problem. So a people problem in terms of making sure that this data is up to date is one thing. But secondly, you do also want to proactively check how your users experience the systems. How is that migration going to affect them? Bugs, response times, connectivity issues. These are the things that tend to dramatically stall cloud migration efforts. And that's why it's key to have a consistent architecture, a current state, and a planning phase for all of these areas. And again, coming back to the need for a proof of concept. You want to know how users are getting value from your applications. So yes, technical performance is important, but customer journey maps, software value streams become vital for a successful cloud migration. There are a few examples here, of course, on some of the dashboards you might want to produce. I won't spend too long on these, but especially for things like business and IT alignment, you're looking at producing roadmaps and technical views. You might be looking at things like security and data compliance, technology roadmaps in terms of what kind of vendors we're going for, what cloud solution providers are we going to use, what systems do we still have, based on Windows Server 2003, what actually needs to be migrated. These are the types of dashboard views that are going to influence some of those decision makers. One final slide from me, of course, and we can open the floor to questions. I appreciate time is short. Is some of the key things to take away. The key thing, I guess, is consideration around cloud migration strategies and the difference between cloud transformation is it's an iterative process. We've talked about most of these areas in quite a lot of detail. How does the application scale? Operational changes are necessary. How do you ensure security by design? It's not just an afterthought. These are some of the key areas to consider. If you can plan for these changes and you can make your team aware of these touch points, you can pretty much confidently start a cloud transformation project and hopefully then reach a successful conclusion. So thank you, of course, everyone, for your time. We've, of course, got some details here on how you can get in touch with us, how we've got an active community that you can be part of, and how we've got ebooks already on cloud optimized enterprise architecture. I think we probably have 10 minutes or so left now for a Q&A section. I realize there's been some questions coming in. I think some of these have been answered in the chat window as well. But Simon, I think if you want to start reading off some of those questions, and we can start addressing those. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Peter. Before I get into the questions, we've had a number of requests for slides. Now, in the past, I've acted as like kind of a point on this. So if you're happy for me to do that, if you'd like a copy of the slides used today, as host today, you'll have my email address. Feel free to contact me, and I will ensure that the team at Avolution get your request, and I'm sure they'll help you with copies of today's slides. So yes, let's work through our way in the QA text facility. First question is from Anita, asking, can you please share your thoughts on nano services when it comes to cloud migration in terms of complexity? Are there any tools that help planning this?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So I guess we talk about nano services or maybe microservices and how maybe these days there's probably a bit of a difference between them. There are tools that can help with that. I guess the key thing from a cloud migration perspective is when you're trying to address anything that's viable to move to cloud, one of the assessments you're going to be making, especially around things like monolithic applications, is how can they be decomposed? How can each section of the application work independently, its own data sets, its own code, its own integrations, and then build up API calls between those services? It's something that I think we've provided some instructions on before as well, around microservices and how you can actually decompose those large applications that are quite difficult to maintain. The other thing quickly to consider, I guess, there is that these terms, of course, come and go. So the key thing really is trying to understand what your landscape looks like. As soon as you have everyone else involved that can provide some feedback on this stuff as well, and yet you have different teams involved, that's, of course, when you'll see the impact of moving things from monolithic microservices and even nano services underneath that as well.
Okay, thank you. Question from Rob. Are there different issues encountered due to data migration effort? That is, not all cloud providers have an easy way to export data.
Yes, so something I guess I haven't highlighted too much, and I think this probably comes to the idea maybe of exporting that data, is things like exit strategies as well, maybe. So if you are going to be deciding on different cloud vendors or different platform vendors, you do want to try and build up an exit strategy that allows you to migrate this data easily. Now, things like AWS and Azure do have some strategies and some technologies that you can use to migrate data easily and export that data. There are, of course, always going to be challenges, but the key in this stage comes back to those proof of concepts. Now, how do you actually import and export this data? How are you physically transferring that? What's the size of the data that's moving across different platforms? That's going to be one of the key ways of understanding how and what vendor you should actually be using.
Good. Barnmars, how long do we need to conduct EA methodology for cloud migration planning and road mapping for large enterprise migration where there is no previous EA practice and no clear understanding of current IT landscape?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, we work with various degrees of customers here who, again, might have an EA practice embedded already and use other tools. And we also come across customers, of course, who've only just started and I'm not quite sure where to start. From an Avolution perspective, we can give you some guidance, but some of the rules of thumb there are trying to understand what data you currently have easy of access to. It could be Excel spreadsheets, visual documents, it could be CMDBs that you have as well. But the first thing is to understand what data you have. Again, without understanding your current state, there's no way of them being able to plan some kind of future state, nevertheless, some kind of cloud migration project. Once that's done, one of the things, of course, is trying to understand some of the metrics around that. So if you are trying to move things to cloud, try and understand why at the beginning. Are there some service dependencies that you can't quite work with right now? Are customers complaining? Are employees complaining? Is there some kind of cost reduction strategy that you're working towards? These are some of the initial aspects. And then the roadmaps tend to come relatively easily out of those, because then you can start leveraging other integrations. So leveraging connections to things like Technopedia. It's a good resource for things like software and hardware standards, licensing costs, end of support dates. You don't always have to come up with this information yourself. So there's plenty of resources out there. We can, of course, direct you in the right way if you want as well. And we can give you some best use cases that most of our customers have worked with and how you can start from scratch and get to almost a cloud transformation project in the first few months. So we can give you some good guidance on that afterwards as well.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Praveen asks, what are the triggers for revisiting EA Cloud strategy? Usually for the market cost features. It says, when should I start revisiting the tools to help that?
Yeah, so one of the things I mentioned earlier on around cloud was innovation. So cloud technologies, and any technology, if you like, does quickly develop. It's a fast-paced environment. One of the reasons you probably want to start reconsidering different platforms or revisiting some kind of cloud migration strategy is during some of those refactoring or replatforming processes. As much as you have something embedded right now, there's quite likely something that you can do to build on that. So when we talked earlier on around refactoring, we've talked about how you can redesign those applications. And I mentioned those 12 app factors. That's going to be one of the key things to consider. The other thing, of course, is cost. You can probably always leverage some more of a scaling cost situation where you're developing different databases, leveraging things like load balancing, also trying to take use out of all of the different technologies that are out there. So when I talk around cloud nativeness as well, there are some good resources. So there are things like the cloud native landscape, which actually is something that comes from a specific body. So if you've heard of Cloud Native Computing Foundation, it's actually launched by Linux in probably about 2014, 15. They provide some good guidance on why you might want to revisit things that are already deployed. And that also gives you a good idea of the current landscape for application development, streaming, databases, remote purchasing, automation. All of these areas typically can be leveraged. And I guess I've yet to meet a single customer that maybe has utilized all of the features of a cloud native application or system. So as usual, there's always room for improvement.
Lovely, thank you. John asks, what is the best approach to elicit data to the amount and quality required to get the big picture ready? How can you get a start picture to initiate a decision when you need to drill down to informations such as detailed cost?
Yep. So again, coming back to how much data you need at the beginning and what kind of metrics. So it's easy just to say just enough data. The idea, of course, is don't aim for perfection. As we said, you want to make sure that you are focusing on key metrics and key pieces of data. That does tend to mean you're going to want different topics from each domain. Of course, not in-depth topics usually. So you're going to want some kind of capability or process level, some idea of how those are supported by different applications you have, and then potentially, of course, where those applications are currently hosted and maybe what data they're accessing or leveraging. Now, those are, let's say, the objects or the elements that you'll be capturing. You want to understand the relationships between those. And again, coming down to the property level, you want to understand things like cost, criticality, what kind of recommendation you're making. That might seem daunting at the beginning, but again, some of the best practices that we've outlined is to leverage other systems and integrations. Start using things like machine learning and algorithms to help generate some of these values. If you're sitting there trying to fill in a 5,000 row spreadsheet, it's going to take you forever. And at the end of that, it's probably going to be out of date. So you want to make sure you get other people involved, other domains, not necessarily enterprise architects, give them the availability to at least see this data. And this is where I've talked around gamification before, around making this data accessible to everyone will encourage other people to fill it in, purely on the fact that different lines of businesses are seeing the progress that people are making and also seeing the outcomes that they're getting from filling that information in. So leverage some of the automated technologies that are out there, and of course, use some of those to populate the data that you currently have and just enhance that data generally.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Herb asks, at which stage would you plan to move the legacy application to container? Is it rehosting, replatforming, or refactoring? How difficult is it?
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty of each of those stages vary, and there are trade-offs, of course, for each as well. So rehosting, of course, as I mentioned, is going to be one of the easiest initially, especially for the speed of migration. But of course, there are risks associated to all of these. Typically, when you're rehosting applications, they're typically black boxes. And then after rehosting, you're probably going to have to go through different tidy ups or fixes that you're actually working on. Replatforming is also quite difficult, especially if you don't have the right skills. And it typically becomes some kind of over-aggressive change as well. You've got to be careful around that. Refactoring in general, typically risks associated with that tend to be the fact that you may be locked into specific vendors then, and it does require a lot more time and skill. So trying to determine the right stage for moving applications or containerization, it is probably quite a difficult question to answer without knowing too much more detail, but typically you want to start understanding the pain points that you're currently experiencing. Is availability down? Is the speed down? Is your efficiency decreases? Certain KPIs are going to be indicators for when you should move over. Another quick, topic on that, and realize time is end. We've got an algorithm that determines which applications should be moved to cloud that we've developed and deployed for different customers as well. So if you're interested, we can send that on. That will give you a great Kickstarter to quickly understand what systems should be moved, why, how, and when. So we can certainly give that out to anyone who's interested too.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for just one final question. And I'm thinking, let's do this one from Aditya. Do you think that financial metrics cash flow is one of the major factors to consider while moving ahead with the cloud?
Yeah, so I think metrics such as finance metrics, cash flow is obviously going to be a key one in this sense. But really what you're trying to do with cloud migration is you're almost moving this kind of CapEx to an OpEx value. So there's going to be a shift of budget. There's going to be a shift of financial details happening for cloud migrations. It's usually a big influencer. Again, we've talked around the myth of how people think cloud is more expensive or less secure. Typically, those come from maybe failed migrations or migrations that haven't been planned properly. So trying to understand financial metrics is, of course, key. And then trying to analyze that is also going to be really important. Because, again, when we start talking around things like technical debt, that does tend to translate into a monetary term. You can have some kind of ratio here in terms of how you're paying off this early debt to then move these applications to a cloud environment. So it's definitely something to consider. And it's certainly something that you want a tool to analyze as well, rolling up these costs and aggregating these across different services, infrastructure, and applications across the entire model.
That's great, Andrew. Thank you for that. Well, we have reached the end of our allotted time, so this would be a good end to stop today's event. But before I do so, Andrew, are there any final points you'd like to make with today's attendees?
Just thank everyone again for your time. Of course, we'll send everyone that's wanting the slides. We'll send you some more information on our ebooks as well. But of course, any questions that you have out of today's session that we haven't managed to answer, apologies for that, then feel free, of course, to email us those questions and we'll do our best to get back and respond to those as well. And of course, thank you, Simon, for allowing us to host this as well.
That's great. Many thank you, everyone. And we'll see you soon, hopefully, in a future webinar from the Oak Group. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.